This session will continue to look at the generation of interpretive discourses of literary readings. And our first speaker is Ms. Joan Swann. She is the director of the Center for Language and Communication at the Open University in England. Ms. Swann is a sociolinguist with particular interest in the study of spoken interaction, including language and creativity, reading group discourse, language, gender and identity, and classroom interaction. She has several publications to her credit, including the book The Art of English Everyday Creativity. She is currently looking at spoken language in the classroom and specifically attempts to teach children particular ways of speaking in the negotiation of identities and the management of relations with others. Ms. Swann will be presenting a paper today on taking a discursive approach to literary reading. So please welcome Ms. Joan Swann.
Thank you very much for the introduction. It's very good to be here. You'll need a handout at some point during the talk. As you were just saying, I'm interested in literary creativity, like Michael Tulin, and like papers yesterday, but with a focus in this case particularly on literary reading or interpretation. So rather than looking at text, how people actually interpret or construct interpretations and evaluations of literary texts. There was reference to this yesterday. Chris Counter mentioned it in his presentation. This morning we heard about creative reading in the first presentation. And Nuri yesterday again talked about consulting focus groups of child readers for his own writing practices. But we've been focusing mainly, I think, on creative production and creative texts with a bit of a change of focus in this session. I want to look at some work I've been doing with two colleagues, Daniel Imes and Kieran Halloran from the Open University in the UK, on the discourse of reading groups. I don't know if reading groups are a big thing in Hong Kong or not. Reading groups are also called book clubs or book groups, people who meet usually every month or so to talk about a literary text they've chosen and construct interpretations of that text. I don't know whether they've caught on, particularly in Hong Kong, but they're quite big in the UK and in the US. So why reading groups then? First of all, because they're significant socially. By that I mean, first of all, there are a lot of them around. So in the UK, estimates about 5 years ago put their number at about 50,000. It's gone up since then. Many more in the States and in other countries. Also, they have a high cultural salience, so they're very prevalent in the media. We've got Opera's book club in the States, Richard and Judy, best known I think in the UK. There are media websites devoted to reading groups. There are magazines devoted to reading groups. Publishers target their new fiction often at groups that often request to included in new books for them to consider during the discussion. So there's a high cultural salience of reading groups then. There's also a whole discourse around the benefits of literary reading. So reading groups again, often meet in members' houses for a chat about books, but you also meet in institutional contexts, so in schools, in prisons, in workplaces. And in that case, the whole discourse surrounding the benefits of reading and discussion, which has been linked to personal development, social development, rehabilitation and reform in prisons, medical benefits in healthcare centres. So for these reasons then, because of their prevalence, their salience, and the range of discourses around reading groups, they're of interest of discourse analysts. Secondly, and more relevant to this conference, they provide evidence of how ordinary readers interpret and evaluate literary texts. So most evidence we have of interpretations comes from professional readers, academics and critics, much as is known about how ordinary people read literary texts. I think because this activity is creative in two senses. First, in that the texts that are being read are archetypally creative texts, literary texts. Secondly, I think the activity itself of interpretation can be seen as a creative one, as readers collaboratively construct meanings and interpretations in particular contexts. That's what I want to come on to later on. Before looking at the research itself, though, I wanted to say something about the nature of the reader in literary study. So taking my first quotation from Carter. Ron Carter, you'll know his work on everyday creativity, the art of common talk. He's responding here to an issue, a special issue of the Journal of Applied Linguistics, where I did with a colleague of mine, Janet Maven. And that was about creativity and discourse. And Carter's review of the special issue referred to the need to focus on not just the producer but the receiver of creative processes. In relation to literary text, that might get in a better understanding of how people received and understood performances or texts or what have you. And Carter linked his argument to arguments in literary criticism about the need for more empirical reader response studies. You get similar arguments elsewhere. I'll put some other references in the handout. I'm just picking Carter as an example of that. That may seem to be an odd request because the reader is endemic in any study of literature, so it may seem odd to ask for more about the reader. But in fact, what is often at stake in studies of literature is an ideal or implied reader. So I'm taking this quotation from Stylistics just as an example from Nick Short, who's one of the leading figures in Stylistics. And you can see that Nick Short's arguing here that stylistics involves considering the structure of a text, which is Michael was doing earlier today of poetry, and seeing how that structure plays a part in helping a reader to arrive at an interpretation of that text. So the reader is important in stylistics, but it's a reader imagined by the analyst. There's much less on ordinary, actual, real readers. Just to illustrate this, a colleague and I, Daniel Allington, did an analysis of language and literature, which is one of the leading journals in the field, to look at how often the reader was invoked in articles. And we looked at the last 5 years of the journal. And we found that in that case, 95% of the papers invoked a reader or reading or readership or what have you, so quite a very high proportion. Of those that didn't, some invoked the audience, so a similar construct. But most of the references which are an implied or ideal reader, which is Nick Short is advocating here. I'll just give you a couple of examples. So this is an example from, excuse me, a paper on Maori speech. And as you can see, it's a textual analysis of Doves Once for Warriors. But there's a phrase there, cast the reader back to Beth in the car, sending her children out to buy their dinner. So this again is an invoked or implied reader, but it's based upon textual analysis. Now we did actually consult readers about the interpretation. Many papers in language and literature take a more cognitive approach. You'd obviously expect there to have a reader reading books, it's cognitive research. An example from Lena Semina's paper on Virginia Woolf's work, and again looking at speech and thought in this case, in relation to blending theory. But again, you can see that Semino is talking about Rosalind speech and thought, arguing therefore that readers need to imagine and so on and so on. So again, Semino is invoking an ideal or implied reader, not actual readers. There's a small number, but a growing number, of empirical research on reading in language and literature, but it's called empirical, but it's usually experimental. It's always experimental. So in this case, you have people would be given textual fragments to evaluate along rating scales, that kind of thing. So you can focus on a particular topic of interest, like metaphor or characterization or whatever, but you're reading in a rather odd environment, not the way people would normally read novels or poetry or what have you. And I've just given an example there of a special issue of the journal edited by Billy Van Heer, in foregrounding, as an issue that was devoted to foregrounding that included studies that were empirical but experimental.